It is a delight to be able to welcome each of you to this critical introduction to land acknowledgements. We are delighted to have Dr. Sydney Beckmann with us this morning. She is an assistant professor in the American Indian Studies program at Fresno State University, right next door to us. To say that she has been instrumental in putting this series together for us would be an understatement. She's put together a wonderful, wonderful panel of speakers that we will hear from later about local indigenous history and contemporary realities. For those of you that might be newer to this community, our conversations in these upcoming weeks grow out of something we did about a year ago where we had a listening session about the topic of land acknowledgements, and people expressed things like openness to it, but wanted to see anything like that backed with concrete actions to seek repair or to learn more about local indigenous history and contemporary realities. So it's been taking us some time to get this together, but it grows out of those conversations, and I look forward to seeing where those will go. I'll turn it over to Dr. Beckmann, and she will proceed with their presentation, and we will go from there. Thank you, and welcome.
All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? No. Oh, right here. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. I will remember to do that. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's okay, gotcha. Thank you. Please be my reminder. Thank you. Thank you all for having me here. It's been really nice to receive this invitation, and I was really glad to get to come here this morning and to kind of see the service. This is my first time at the church, but I have been, really grateful to get to know Pastor Audrey and Pastor Brian for a little over a year now. And so I met Pastor Audrey because we both volunteer at the Native Garden on campus at Fresno State. And so I moved to Fresno in August 2024, so I'm still pretty new here. And I have to say it was so nice meeting every other week and seeing Audrey and Michelle and the three of us kind of connecting every other Thursday. And as I was new here and meeting a lot of different faces every week, it was nice to just regularly get to see some familiar faces. So it's been really nice as I have gotten to, be introduced to Fresno State to connect with Pastor Audrey right away. And we actually have Michelle here, which is, I've named us she is the one, Michelle Pipkin is a Choinumni plant expert, and she's the one who actually runs the Native Garden. And so Audrey and I follow her lead there. So thank you for being here. It's good to see you. So I will say, though, even though I met Audrey first, I actually weirdly had a connection to the Willow Avenue Mennonite Church before I ever moved here. So funny enough, about 2 months before I moved here, in June of 2024, I went up for a workshop at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And there I had a colleague, Joe Wiebe, who is from the Mennonite community there. And I was telling him that, hey, I have this job and I'm moving to Fresno. And he was like, hey, I was there a couple decades ago. And he's like, there's a good community there. And I said, okay, great. And honestly, I forgot about it. Right? I left there and went immediately to moving, and dealing with that and the logistics and starting a new job, and very overwhelming. All good stuff, but overwhelming too. And so even when meeting, Audrey, I didn't make the connection until much, much later. And so I actually saw Joe back in November at a conference, and I said, Joe, this is what I'm doing. I found a great community, a Mennonite community. And he was like, which church? And I said, Willow Ave. And he was like, that's the one. Right? So somehow it feels we're kind of just destined to be here, and I was destined to get to work with you all. So that has been really nice for me to get to do that. Let me see, make sure this is working. There we go. All right. So I have then been working with Brian for about I would say almost a year now. We met for the first time last spring to kind of start this conversation of what would it look like? What could we do? What could this process be? And so that has been a real joy to get to do. And I found that this is actually something that has served me really well. I've learned a lot through this process. I did a little bit of research and some work on land acknowledgements when I was a graduate student at the University of Arizona. It was the first time I authored an article. I co-authored it with my bestie at the time. So it was our first time, the two of us kind of figuring out the publishing process, we thought we were going to publish this paper and change the world, right? We definitely published the paper. We did not change the world, right? But it's been really fun, actually, as I have been working on this project with Brian to kind of think back to when I was like a little grad student, and so I've really enjoyed that. And as I'll briefly mention here in a minute, I've actually just recently started on a project with my colleague at Fresno State, Dr. George Roja, to do a living land acknowledgement on Fresno State using augmented reality. So we'll talk about that in just a second, but all of this to say that it actually ended up being really great timing to get to work with you all and to think about land acknowledgements. So I really see my role today as just a facilitator. And honestly, I can't even really say that I'm helping you all begin the conversation, because you have been doing that, right? Well before today. There are times that I should have just said it because I thought it was funny, but there were times, Brian, when we would talk that I was like, why am I here? Right? And I was like, you guys are doing so much work. I know that you had an initial talking session to think about, right, what would a land acknowledgement here look like? I know that you have done the reading for a book on the doctrine of discovery. You brought in Roman Raintree to talk about, federal and non-federal, federally recognized tribes and land trusts. So I really was throughout this process thinking, I don't know why I'm here, right? But so for today specifically, right, I just want to introduce a couple of contexts, introduce some context about land acknowledgement, some critiques, and then kind of maybe some alternatives or ways to kind of think about this process. And I think the real content is going to come from, right, our stuff. I'm so used to having one of these with a laser pointer. Sorry. So I'm trying to point at it. But our future workshops that we have, right, where we're bringing in local indigenous experts to actually talk about the land here, right, and what it means, in the past and in the present. And so I think that's really where you're going to get the chance to kind of think substantively about what do you want your land acknowledgement to look like. So today I hope to just be able to help frame some of that conversation. And so since I actually haven't had the chance to be here with you all before, I've been kind of in conversation with Brian and Audrey. I just wanted to give everyone the chance, is there anything kind of right now that we want to put on the table to make sure, a question or a topic that we want to make sure and address today? Everyone good? Low expectations. I love it. I thrive under low expectations. Okay, perfect. There will be time, I think, for questions and conversation after, and that might be a little bit more helpful. Make sure I keep looking back, and it's right there. Sorry, everyone. So to jump right in, I just want to talk a little bit about the practice of land acknowledgements and kind of where they come from. And actually, land acknowledgements are rooted in the indigenous practice of recognizing and acknowledging other communities, other nations, other peoples, right? And so this is both a cultural and a political practice, right? And I think we can all understand the importance and significance of recognizing or not recognizing other nations, right, other peoples. We see that today, I think, most prominently with Palestine, right? So there are consequences when we recognize or don't. And so for land acknowledgements and indigenous communities, this is a much bigger, larger practice that is, again, cultural and political. And so not only if we're thinking about Palestine, but we also then have to recognize the history of settler colonialism in the United States is very much about recognizing or not recognizing tribal sovereignty, right? So this idea of recognition and its importance is something that I want to make sure when we're talking about land acknowledgements, we're going to talk about a specific context and how it's used today, but it's rooted in these practices. So as we're thinking then about the history of settler colonialism in the United States and the erasure of indigenous peoples, right, the refusal to recognize the tribal sovereignty of tribal nations, right, this is where then the practice of land acknowledgements that we know today, that's where it came from. So around probably, I would say about 2015, is when land acknowledgements were really kind of a recognized practice. They were really growing. Most institutions by this point are kind of scrambling, right, to find a land acknowledgement, to figure out how to implement it. And it really came primarily, it kind of started in Canada. That's where it was really a big practice. And then other places like New Zealand and Australia. and the United States started to pick up on this practice. So around 2015, we're not only seeing this growing in practice, but then we're also starting to see some critiques of it, right? So like, who are they serving? What is this actually doing, right? And then it grows from there. And then we move into 2020, where this was a very pivotal moment for land acknowledgements and for these conversations about universities. So High Country News put out this really major research project, right? Has anyone heard of like the land grab universities? This research project. Anyone heard of the land grant institutions? Yeah, right? So what this project did is it really focused on the history of land grant institutions, right? So what are they? Where did they come from? You know, what does it mean for Native communities? And what we found is that, or what they found is that by looking at how land grant institutions were established, right, they could actually pinpoint where they could actually look at the connection between universities today and the very direct connection to stolen land. So land grant institutions were created through the Morrill Acts, right? 2 different Morrill Acts, and this was post-Civil War. Congress was trying to establish education, and they specifically wanted to establish higher education institutions for the working class, right? And so they really focused on education geared towards like engineering and science and agriculture. And the idea is also to make higher education possible for working class people. So we have then these Morrill Acts, which are then used to establish universities, right? Now, that sounds really good, but we have the question, where did the land come from to get those universities established, right? So to no one's surprise, we probably know where it came from, right? And so this is why the 2020 land grab universities research was so pivotal, because what that research found was actually, sorry, I can't read that over there, was that approximately 10.7 million acres were taken from nearly 250 tribes, bands, and communities through over 160 violence-backed land cessions. So what this research did, it did all of like the combing through archives to actually be able to make the connection between the land grant institutions that exist today, right, and to trace it all the way back to where they actually got the land. And they were able to see that it's coming from really violent-based, right, land theft and land seizures, right? So this research then was really huge and pivotal in connecting very directly current universities today, right, and land theft. So it isn't just this kind of like, oh, settler colonialism, that happened forever ago, right? Like, no, this is very tangible, and universities are continuing to profit, right, off of this stolen land. So I think one of the big things, besides doing the work to actually get us these figures, what this report did was it really made the ongoing violence of settler colonialism very tangible. People could actually see the institutions that we very often in society say like that higher education is good, right? And as a professor, yes, higher education is good. We support it, right? But part of higher education is, right, thinking about where we are and the consequences of what we do. And so even these institutions that today might do some really good work, right, we have to be able to be critical. We have to be able to have the really difficult questions of where they come from. So 2020, so we have 2015, right, it's prominent. We're seeing a lot of people doing this, beginning to see some critiques as well. And then 2020 with the High Country News and that report really changed the conversations. So there were questions about land acknowledgements, especially at universities. They became very, very popular at universities. And so this juxtaposition between like, you know, what is the purpose of especially a higher ed institution, a land grant university doing a land acknowledgement? So this is where we see some of the really main critiques coming about with land acknowledgements. And so we have the first, which is that they're ahistorical oftentimes. So the language in them, they don't actually talk about, again, how the university developed, right? They don't talk about the history and continued presence of indigenous peoples. And one of the critiques, along with being ahistorical, is using the past tense, right? Saying, we're going to honor the indigenous communities here, and, as this was their homelands, this is where they used to live, right? So really thinking about the language and the time and how that is presenting indigenous peoples today, right? So land acknowledgements were widely critiqued for that. We also have the major critique that they were formulaic and generic, right? I think I spoke to Pastor Brian before that, I think in one of the Bibles, or in the hymnal book, right? So there is an example of a land acknowledgement that's just kind of standard, and it's like insert tribe here, right? Like honestly, right? That's the format. And the question is, like, how is that an acknowledgement really, right? Like, what does that do? So the fact that they were, very formulaic and generic and just placed somewhere, and like, what did we do after that? Right? So that was another major critique. It's also a matter of labor, right? So one of the things that happened once the university said, oh, so this is what we're all doing now? Okay, then every Native Studies department, every Native faculty on campus was now on a committee to do land acknowledgements, right? And writing a land acknowledgement is more than just typing something on a piece of paper, especially for Native faculty and Native Studies faculty. If you're going to write a land acknowledgement, that means you're going to every single tribal nation, right, who's going to be in the land acknowledgement. And you tell them, this is what we're doing. This is what we want to say. What do you want to be in this, right? Do you even want this to happen? And they do that individually. And here in the Central Valley, we have a lot of tribal communities. Some universities, you just have one, right? In the Central Valley here, we got a lot. So you got to talk to a lot of people. So it takes a lot of work and time, right, to even get a draft, and then that has to be approved each time, right? Because if you're going to do it the right way, it takes work and time and labor. So now suddenly we have Native faculty and departments who have a whole lot of labor to do, and they weren't paid for it, right? So that was another consequence of doing land acknowledgements this way, which also connects to the other major critique of tokenizing, right? So the other thing that happened with the development of land acknowledgements was that oftentimes you would bring in community members or elders to actually give a land acknowledgement at the beginning of any sort of event. And so they'd come and they'd do that, and they'd essentially like perform, and then they would leave, right? They weren't included in the rest of the event. There was no meaningful dialogue, right? Their knowledge wasn't brought into the space and whatever was happening there, right? So, and again, unpaid, right? So we're talking about unpaid labor and tokenizing, right? And so what all of these then kind of went into was this question of like these ethical issues, but really land acknowledgements were meant to disrupt, right? This idea of like settler colonialism and these practices that reinforce settler colonial institutions. And instead, it actually ended up almost reinforcing them, right? So if institutions could then say, oh, look, we did a land acknowledgement, and pat themselves on the back and say, look, we did it, right? Then you end up actually just reinforcing the institution and what it does. And it actually then prevents the university, or sort of gives them a cop-out, from actually having to engage with indigenous communities in a meaningful, ongoing way, right? So these are many of the critiques that came about and are still talked about today, but especially with that 2020 report that came out, land acknowledgements and the conversations around them it was a real pivoting point. And so there were a lot of critiques about that. So from that 2020, one of the things that happened is that you kind of had two different main directions, two different sort of opinions of what are you going to do with land acknowledgements now. And one direction was just to refuse it altogether, right? And I have this quote here that I want to read because I think it's one of the most beautiful ways to actually describe this act of refusal when it comes to land acknowledgements. And so this is coming from Joe Wark in his article called Land Acknowledgements in the Academy, Refusing the Settler Myth. And so Joe writes, when our knowledges, which we know are beautiful and contain much wisdom, are perverted in ways that support our oppression, a refusal to continue offering these gifts to the Academy is often necessary. Refusal is an act of love for our culture and who we are as a people. And so whenever I have to talk about, right, what it means to like not do a land acknowledgement, this is the way that I describe it. Because I think there's a lot of meaning, and it's a really beautiful way to say that what we have, right, as communities our knowledges, we're not going to share that if it's going to be perverted and if it's going to be used against us, right, to commit violence against us. So after 2020, and thinking about this, one option was just to refuse as an act of love and respect for their own communities and cultures, right? And so I offer this then because one of the other avenues was to continue to use land acknowledgements, right? And a lot of times people saw those as really opposing, right? You either do it or you don't, and if, right? They saw it as, again, like kind of a fight. I actually don't see these as opposed. I see them as strategies, right? And when we're thinking about dealing with the ongoing system of settler colonialism, it requires strategies. So in certain locations and certain times, right, it might be the strategy of refusal that ends up being what communities need, and it ends up being most effective, right? So it's a strategy. I myself, I go in the direction of using land acknowledgements, right, instead of refusing. That's partly because I work at higher education institutions, right? So the whole point of my job and higher education is to teach people, right? And one of the things that I have found, every semester, I begin all of my classes with a land acknowledgement, right? And I connect it to what we're going to talk about in the class, and the content, and, right? But I start us out with a land acknowledgement. And one of the things that I have found consistently so far in the 2 years of being here is when I put the land acknowledgement up on the screen and I ask students, right, have you ever heard of the Yokuts and the Mono? And I get like 2 hands, right? And I want to stress too that I also on the first day ask, like, where are people from, right? And with maybe the exception of 1, maybe 2 students, they're all from the Central Valley or Fresno. So then I connect that information and I say, okay, so I'm not from here, but you all are from here, and you're telling me you've never even heard of the Yokuts or the Mono, let alone the history, let alone, connection to where we are in Fresno, like none of that, but just you've never heard of the Yokuts and the Mono. And I find that really significant. And so, oh my gosh, these are really like precious things here that I'm like backing up against. So for me, in my position in higher education institutions, I think it's important to use land acknowledgements for the basic visibility of it, right? The fact that I'm still coming into contact regularly with large groups of people who don't even know that the Yokuts and the Mono are the indigenous peoples whose lands we're on right now, right at Fresno State. So I use land acknowledgements strategically in that way. And I'm going to assume, though, just in this room for the sake of the rest of this presentation, that you all want to move forward thinking about land acknowledgements, right? How to use them, in what way we can move beyond them, things like that, right? But I wanted to present at least kind of this knowledge, right, that an act of refusing to do it is something that can be useful and I think quite meaningful and beautiful as well, right? So and even if, right, for me, I don't choose that option to refuse them, I then try to use them and think about them strategically, make them better, right? But I think there's something to learn, even if we choose a different strategy. So just as we're continuing to have these conversations and you're moving forward, just keep that in mind, right? And even just the reasoning behind why you might want to refuse is something good to know. So choosing our strategy. So then if we're at the point we're all on the same page that we at least want to talk about and think about what it would look like to move forward and how we engage with land acknowledgements, I think one of the best ways to think about this is land acknowledgements are a starting point, right? They're not an end point. One of the reasons that we have so many of the critiques that we just went over about land acknowledgements is because universities and institutions often treat them as the end point, right? They say, yep, we made it, pat ourselves on the back, we're good to go, and done, right? They never have any meaningful engagement, they don't do anything else, it's an end point. So I think if we're gonna have the basic conversation of like, how do we use a land acknowledgement, it's a starting point. Right? One of the things that they do is it's a basic level, a very low bar of just visibility, right? So if my students are coming into my classes and they've never even heard of the Yokuts and Mono, at least on the first day, they're gonna walk out having heard about them. And then hopefully the rest of the semester, we reinforce that with some good information behind it, right? So Also seeing it in different places, right? So when the university puts it on PowerPoints or different agendas, or when other professors around campus also use it at the beginning of the semester, we're building basic visibility, right? And that is important, right? Because we don't have that, right? We have such a low bar here. And so land acknowledgements, I think, used in that way, at least offer that starting point, right? But we have to build on that. And so one of the things in moving forward is asking, so how can we build on land acknowledgements, right? How can we treat them as an ongoing practice instead of just a stagnant piece of writing on a piece of paper, right? So I think that's the biggest difference, is practice, ongoing, and as a starting point. And so I want to offer just a couple of examples. I hope that it works. Just kind of 2 examples of kind of around here, ways that people are thinking about land acknowledgements in creative ways to kind of push back against kind of this static written statement. I hope that it works. I think if I can get some tech support. Sorry, I hope that it works. Yeah, so sorry about that. I have 2 videos embedded in the next 2 slides. If not, I can describe them as well. No, it was linked to like a YouTube clip, both of them. But that's okay. Yeah. That's okay. What I can do is I plan to share a bunch of resources from today too. And so I'll describe it here, and it's a little less effective, but I'll make sure that you have it afterwards and you can make all those connections there. Yeah, sorry about that. All right, and that's what I have to do when I teach too, and like technology fails all the time. So the good thing, at least you get to see here, we'll see Kenny Barrios. So one of the reasons I wanted to show this example is not only it's a creative way that Lemoore College, so locally, is thinking about land acknowledgements, but also Kenny Barrios is one of the experts and guest speakers who will be here in the last workshop. So I thought it was a nice way to at least get to introduce Kenny. And so what you'll see when you get this material is that Lemoore College created this video, right, of their land acknowledgement. And they actually have local community members coming in and creating this, talking about what the land is like, right, what it means for their community. And then they also have kind of interspersed throughout not only these local indigenous community members coming in, but also different faculty members and administrative members on campus. And so what you have is this really kind of lovely way of acknowledging the land. And you see kind of even with the different voices, how the university is trying to show engagement and relationships with local Native communities, right? So one of the things is, if we're really pushing back against this idea of just like a static thing that you read, right? To create a project like this, you can't create it without having a relationship with local Native communities, right? Now, I don't know how they made this in terms of like labor. I would imagine and think, right, that folks were compensated for what they did, right? But already with just an example of like this, we're pushing back against some of those critiques of labor, right? Who's involved, kind of representation and visibility, right? It's not something about local Native communities, it's something that they are instrumental in making, right? So when we're thinking about land acknowledgements in this way, the modality can matter, and it can make a difference, right, in pushing back against some of those critiques. My second example, I think my clicker isn't working. Oh, there we go, right, thank you. So this is a short clip of Santa Clara and their university, and they're actually implementing augmented reality technology to have like an app on your phone to be able to use and look around the campus, to be able to kind of show what the land looked like then, to showcase Native culture. And it also has with that like the voices of local community members talking about their history and their culture, right? And so this is a way that you can interact with the space that you're on and actually really see and interact with and learn from Native communities, right? And their culture and their knowledges. This is actually something similar that, as I referenced, my colleague, Dr. George Roja and I were currently working on a grant proposal to try to do something like this at Fresno State. So we have our land acknowledgement at Fresno State, which Dr. Leslie Oliver was really instrumental in bringing about. She did that work of going to each tribal nation, right, and talking with them and working with them. And so we want to expand on that work, right, and expand land acknowledgements in that way. So with these two examples, just kind of brief, right, of what land acknowledgements could look like, even just changing up how we're thinking about them can make a big difference. Now, it might be the case that these examples maybe aren't for this community. I don't know if you want to do augmented reality here, right? That maybe it doesn't work, right? I think that tends to be something that can be really effective at universities when you have large groups of people coming in, people from everywhere, right? The university tends to have a lot of tours, so we would want something like this to be incorporated in that. So when people are coming to Fresno State, they're also interacting with and learning from local indigenous communities, right? Learning from the Yokuts and the Mono. So things like this, even if you don't do it, can maybe help you think about a little more creatively, like what you could do, what the possibilities are. There you go. And kind of my final example, or what I want to talk about, is part of the information that I'll provide you all afterwards. There's something coming from the Native Governance Center, which has a lot of good information about land acknowledgements and how to go beyond them. And so one of the things is going beyond is I don't actually think like it means that you can't do a statement, right? So you could create a statement, right? But what does it mean to actually put that into practice then? And so going beyond a land acknowledgement in that way is really trying to get everyone to have those conversations. So as part of some of the literature that they actually have a really useful, almost like worksheet, a self-assessment that you can do. And they have some questions that I think could be useful for you all as you're thinking about, like, what do we want this to look like, right? And so they have some things like step 1 is to do a self-assessment. And so some of the questions in thinking about that would be, are you appropriating Native culture, right? Are you voting against Indian country? Right? In the workplace, are you failing to research and hire Native vendors? That might not apply here, but what it might mean is that as you're bringing in guest speakers, right, are you bringing in, right, local Native communities to do that? So, like, in what way, does your community operate, in relationship to, right, the Yokuts and the Mono, right? So some of these can be really helpful in that way, just getting you thinking. Things along those lines, do a resource assessment, right? So can you set aside money each month, right? Do you have time to show up, right, for Native-led events, right? For protest events, right? So even if you don't have money, like, in what way are you showing up and engaging with Native communities, right? One of the things that's a part of this literature that I'll provide as well is voluntary land taxes, right? Has anyone heard of voluntary land taxes? Yeah, right? So it's basically, right, you as a community can decide to think about having a land tax, right, and submitting that to local Native communities, right? And I think that's especially interesting here in the context of churches when, like, religious institutions, like, are tax exempt, right, from federal and, like, state property taxes, right? So it's something to consider. Now, that's a really big step. And as part of the literature, they say, like, don't just do that right away. You got to be in conversation about that. You have to be in conversation as a community to talk about what that would look like, what that would mean. You have to talk about with the local communities, right? You can't just, like, start throwing money at people, right? That's a big process, right? And so they say, like, enter into that slowly and deliberately. But just to think about what are the possibilities if we're trying to move beyond just acknowledging and recognizing, right? And not just recognizing the labor that goes into asking people to create a land acknowledgement, right? But how are we actually going to be in community with local indigenous and, like, tribal nations? What does that look like? And it can look like showing up to protests, right? Making sure that you're not voting against Native country, right? Indian country, right? So this is, I think, giving you, before you even get to thinking about what would you want your land acknowledgement to look like, different ways, first thinking about what is your relationship with local Indigenous communities now, right? And being able to kind of ask those questions. Other things, as you'll see, right, doing your research, which I think you guys are already starting to do with this workshop series, right? So this kind of leads you through how to think about a land acknowledgement besides focusing on what do I want it to say, right? Like, what do we want it to say? Actually think about what do you want to do, right? What do you want the ongoing relationships to look like? And so this is where I'll kind of end, right? But I want to say that, like, thinking about beginning points and end points, right? Land acknowledgements are the beginning point. And I think as long as we keep that in our mentality, it's a starting point, then that's a much better direction. So if I can leave you with maybe 2 recommendations for whatever it's worth, take it if you want it, right? The first thing is to kind of make this your starting point. And then the second thing is I have this quote here. As I was kind of prepping for this and trying to find some literature and just seeing what the current conversation is with land acknowledgements, I found this quote coming from Anthropology News, and I want to actually read it. It says that land acknowledgements should not be feel-good maneuvers. If an acknowledgement is discomforting and triggers uncomfortable conversations, it's likely on the right track. And I agree with that, and I also disagree with it a little bit. Right? It's not the first time I've disagreed with anthropology. Will not be the last, right? I think the point here that I want to connect it back to is when we talked about Joe Wark and his active refusal, right? That was something when I read that and I understand and I think about why he's saying that, it's something that feels really good. Good in the sense of deeply meaningful and powerful, and it was a decision rooted in care, right? So it feels good in that way. And so as we're thinking about endpoints, right, I think that your endpoint should feel that. I think your endpoint should be something where you feel good, right, where it's rooted in care, rather than this sort of shallow feel good, right? Pat yourself on the shoulder. And so I think that that's the difference, right, is being able to distinguish between these 2 senses of feeling good. Now, I will say, right, to get to that deeper sense of feeling good that's rooted in care that I think maybe only poets can describe, right? I think you have to do this process, right? I don't think you can get there without doing the work to actually think about what is your relationship to Native communities? Maybe in what ways, without realizing it, right, you might be causing harm. To actually be able to do that, that might be the uncomfortable process, right? But if we're thinking about beginning points and ending points, I don't think that should be the ending point. I also think the feeling good, right, rooted in that deep ethic of care, right, and connection, that has to be something that also local Indigenous communities have to feel with you. So it's not just this community either. And so I would say that I think that this community is very well situated to be able to distinguish between those 2 different things, right? Maybe if I were talking to a corporate institution, I would have a lot less faith in the ability to distinguish between that, right? But I would say is the end point, it should be something where it feels like an ongoing practice of maintaining meaningful relationships, right? And I think if you can get to that point where it feels like that for everyone involved, that's when you know you're at least hopefully on the right track, right? So I offer those 2 recommendations, right, for whatever they're worth. But hopefully it's at least a starting point, a way for you all as a community to kind of engage with this conversation of land acknowledgements. So I will leave it there and just say thank you all again for the invitation to be here.